How about that?
That's brilliant.
Yeah. Do we have a quorum?
Mm-hmm. Yep, can see that.
One of the delights of running virtual masterclasses over the last year has been having to manage these sort of issues, and it's one of the funny things that always happens is you end up with everybody thinking it's somebody else, which is rather amusing. I started off in South Africa actually, I think during the pandemic last year, on one of these, and it was really quite funny with running a 4-day masterclass, and actually the bandwidth to South Africa was better than it was into parts of the UK. So it does go to show. Okay, what I'm going to try and do over the next 15 to 20 minutes, assuming you can all cope with that, is just to reflect on probably 45, 50 years of working globally. My business career, believe it or not, started back in 1972, I think. Something like that. Anyway, a hell of a long while ago. But actually, from day one, I was working for international institutions. My first job in the city was with an organisation called Lloyd's and Bolsa, which was the Bank of London and South America. It went on to Bank of Nova Scotia, and then 20 years with the investment bank for Saudi Arabia. So I sort of cut all of my working life teeth on aeroplanes. So I was flying the Lockheed TriStar back in the day when everybody did, and remember the 707 with great affection. So it's quite interesting today, just looking at taking a step back. But the title comes from actually something my daughter once said to me, because during my much of my early career, I would be doing something like 60 to 80 flights a year. So she'd sort of say to me, what Daddy, one day she said to me, Daddy, are you a spy? And I think it was partly to do with the fact that I was given a couple of passports as well as citizenship of another country. So she could never quite understand why I was always moving around and always seemed to be one step ahead of what was going on. But I'm going to share with you now just a bit of light. Anybody any idea where that departure lounge is? I'll take comments. You can put them in the chat if you want to, or just shout them out. Any thoughts?
Stornoway.
Where, Paul?
Stornoway.
Not with that weather. Anybody else? Well, it's actually El Fasher Airport in Darfur, and that picture was taken in 2010, about February, March 2010. Actually, it was February, I think. But it was quite funny, and I have another picture which I sometimes use of a Heathrow baggage trolley, which goodness knows how it got there, but it was outside of the. So basically, I've spent a lot of my life traveling and always on business. But what I'm going to share with you, and I hope this is of interest to some of you, is just to talk a little bit about some of the experiences I've had and give those of you who are involved in this some tips. Aidan very kindly gave me a bit of an intro. You can find a lot more about me if you go on to this link. It's probably better to do that rather than me talk about it. But as he said, I've had the privilege of being involved in a few titles, most of which now seem to have been very well received. But what I want to start with really is just to talk a little bit about what the presidential role is at the moment, go into some of the international assignments and just talk about the whys and hows, and then maybe do a few reflections at the end. And I hope that will prove a stimulating sort of circumnavigation of the globe, if you like. One of the aspects of the CILIP presidential role was that nobody had ever written anything down, as far as I could see. It was, and I'd ask questions when I was invited to sort of participate. Well, okay, what is expected? And it wasn't totally clear. So those of you who know me, and Nikki probably does, I tend to, okay, if there's a vacuum, I'll fill the void. So I suggested that there would be sort of three pillars, building on some of the excellent work that others have done, particularly certainly IUB as regards as international assignments idea, international corporate collaboration, because that's what my whole being has been about, working in something like 36 countries and traveling to nearly 100. So over the years, for me, we've learned so much from working with other people that it felt, you know, it felt honourable to build on what he'd done, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. The other thoughts that I believe that one of the things we should be doing is maybe using the presidential role to just have some discussions and debates. And as you've already seen, we had one with last year's president. I invited her to do the first one. I've invited Kate, who is the vice president, to do the final one on the 24th. And I'm going to be leading the session on the 30th and on the 29th of September. I'll talk more about the 30th in a minute. So basically, that's just 60 minutes of discussion on something that I think or others have suggested is a hot topic. The second thing is something that I call presidential musings, which is in the magazine, The Information Professional. I've been inviting people from around the globe to give their thoughts on topics that I think will be of interest to the wider membership and all people who read the Information Professional magazine. So picking up Aidan's point, the first column under that was with two people who are at the forefront of the ISO implementation process, ISO 30401. One was one of my fellow co-authors, but actually the first globally recognized ISO accredited KM auditor. And the other one was from the chief knowledge officer of a law firm who has actually introduced ISO into the business. So they were the first ones. The next one I'll tell you about in a minute. The final thing is something I call in conversation with, and I think this came as a bit of a shock to my colleagues within CILIP, because I don't think anybody had ever suggested that the idea would be useful if the president actually spoke on a regular basis to different members just for a chat and a getting to know you session. I reasoned that one of the big challenges I would face this year would be, I'm not going to meet anybody. And frankly, it's a strange experience being the figurehead, if you like, of an organization where you don't actually get to meet anybody. So one of the first things I suggested was that every Thursday, as it happens, I've been talking to people, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And it's just a fairly structured 30-35 minute conversation, but I have got to meet the most interesting people and have surfaced so many interesting stories. And, you know, I started in Copenhagen, I was in Dublin last week. So I'm talking internationally as well as domestically, and through all the different groups. So LGTB+, a whole range of different people, government information groups. So that's sort of the three things that I've been, if you like, have been at the core of what I'm doing. And the purpose of the In Conversation with really is for me to understand what's making people tick and to surface the stories of the good that people are actually doing in this profession or industry. So the first debate I'm going to be sort of leading is going to be with somebody you may have heard about. She wrote a very interesting article in The Guardian a few months ago about the Little Wartime Library. She's a fantastic person. She writes for the Sunday Times, The Guardian. Her books normally get sort of fly off the shelves. I think she gets about 10,000 sales in the first couple of days. And Kate's going to be talking about some of the experiences that she's had from interviewing 100 librarians. So she will be involved, and I have a few other surprise guests who are also coming along on June the 30th. So as you can see, and that's been driven partly by some work that I was involved with, where I sat on the COBRA committee for the city I live in Eastbourne. And I was conscious from being quite sort of at the centre of the civic leadership that one of the big challenges was that libraries were particularly vulnerable all the time, but some of the good that they were doing was never actually surfaced or recognised. So that we're just going to surface this a bit. And I was talking via our MP to the people who've been producing the levelling up reports. And whilst there's some good stuff in there, recognising the pivotal role that people play, some of it's gone too far into the sort of volunteering spectre. So that's just a non-librarian view, but hopefully I can act as a catalyst for an interesting discussion. The other thing I talked about is around the idea of the presidential musings. The one that is about to hit your stands is about onboarding in a virtual world. And there's a couple of people, one you'll recognise, Martin White. The other gentleman is a guy called James Robertson, who is the one of the world's leaders on the use of intranet. So he, Martin and I have been discussing here about one of the big challenges of working in a virtual world, and that's virtual onboarding. And finally, just going back to the presidential role, the idea of in conversation with, one of the things that I had done is to pick up the comments that people have made, and with their permission, I'm starting to drip feed those back into dialogues and conversations, excuse me, so that we get a better view of what librarians and what people in the information profession have done. I've had a fantastic conversation a few weeks back with one of the leaders of I think it was Public Health England, who'd been doing amazing work around evidence-based knowledge and feeding that back in around long COVID. So there's a whole raft of people who have done some amazing things in this industry. So that's it, and in a way that summarizes what I think it's about. It's actually very much as a catalyst, a matchmaker, and a connector. As I said, I've worked so many places, so I've been able to sort of be at the forefront of getting the Chartered Knowledge Manager accreditation much more visible around the world. And I've spoken at many events in Asia and led events there where, you know, we've got people involved, and I was delighted when one of the people who attended the first became the first Asian Chartered Knowledge Manager a couple of weeks ago. And certainly as much more as the figurehead in the future, once we get back, there's a program of events, I think from Q3 and 4, where I'm going to be able to hopefully use some of the influencing skills to represent this profession in a better way and to start the dialogue around where can it go. So that's sort of where I see it. And it just goes to prove this slide. Not every event is particularly glamorous. That's obviously an airport. Many of you, it's Dubai Airport. I was in transit on my way back from Singapore. I'd been working, I think, in Manila at the time, and I'd stopped off in Singapore to do some work, and I came back, and unfortunately, it's one of those absurd things where I tried to go up the escalator the wrong way and fell over, and my knee ended up in a particularly unpleasant thing, which isn't the greatest thing when you're wearing trousers of that colour. So I ended up sort of being escorted through Dubai Airport in a wheelchair, which was quite amusing. And what was quite funny was one of my colleagues who I'd worked on a previous assignment with in Tehran thought it was amusing because 2 years previously I'd pushed him through Dubai Airport in a wheelchair because he'd had his foot operated on. So just goes to show sometimes it's not that easy. And every one of these tells a story in a way. I mean, the one top left was actually in the center of Khartoum. And the reason I'm showing you that picture is because very much a picture tells 1,000 words. And some of the things you have to learn when you're doing international assignments is understanding the what happens with local customs. So at the time, we landed, I think, in 2010 in Khartoum, and Sudan was at the time certainly in the eye of a number of organisations for its treatments, and we were working on a knowledge management strategy with the World Health Organization, and one of the things we always did was capture experiences on with cameras, with shots, so that we could play them back for discussions. Well, the problem is that you try and get into Sudan with a camera. The first thing that happens is it gets taken off you. The second thing is you disappear. So at the time, and this is 11 years ago, trying to find a phone that doubled up with a very good camera was a challenge. The one in the middle at the top was from an assignment that I led in 2005 in Jeddah with the World Bank for the Islamic world, the Islamic Development Bank. And we were developing a set of oral histories. And I was particularly proud of that one because I remember having to field at a conference I was speaking at on behalf of the IDB in Kuala Lumpur 2 years later. And the Secretary General of the African Development Bank was kept on about, well, how can you work there? Where are the women? And this particular assignment, I took 5 English women with me, all of whom agreed to wear the burqa and the hijab, as you can see. It was their personal choice, but this was 982 men and 2 women in this organization. And that was really about changing culture and customs. As a result, what made me really proud was that it was the kickoff of the Young Professionals program, which actually involved a female leading it. And that was the first of many. The one on the right is from an assignment meeting in Tehran with Iran's largest company in 2013, just after the new president had been elected. It was particularly significant because there was a recognition that if you embed knowledge into the way you develop new products, you can change the way people think about things. And again, there were so many myths that were debunked when I went there. I had an image of Iran, having spent 20 years across the Gulf, which was completely contradictory. This is not the time and place to go into that, but it was an interesting experience. And the final thing is when I led a panel in Lisbon, which is where I also am proud to have a home, and proud to also be a Portuguese citizen, which is a great honor. But this was at a multinational event in Lisbon, and we were debating the use of social networks in organizations. So it's this is just by way, not showing off, more just to give you a grounding of the sort of places I've been and the sort of experiences that are going to allow me to share some of the recommendations I'm going to make to you. Many years ago, I guess, 2013, I was approached to become one of the founding trustees of a charity in the UK. And it was because I had a passion that I didn't think that people should be hungry. We'd seen a million food banks rise from nowhere over a period of time. And I was conscious at the time that there was so much surplus food coming out of the hospitality industry that we could do something about it. Now, the lady that took over as chief executive of the charity, called Plan Zeros, was Portuguese, which was fortunate because I speak a little Portuguese, not much, but and she was very well educated. But the chairman was a colonel in the British Army, former colonel in the British Army, and I ended up by sharing this slide with her because it was one of those challenges at board meetings where he would say something, and she would, and this is from a Dutch person who I've met, but it sums it up. If you read some of these and think about the conversations that we have, certainly in a political sphere, this is most important. I mean, the one that gets me always is very interesting, and the Dutch would understand it. They are impressed, and the British mean I don't like it. And being married to a Portuguese, I often find how useful this particular chart is. So if a Portuguese puts down a dinner in front of you, the only time they actually do then interpret it as I don't like it. So if you dare say that looks interesting, it evokes a reaction which is slightly south of a nuclear explosion. So it's one of those things that you just have to think about. And were you ever to deal with this sort of situation, I would encourage you to think about something like this. I led an assignment with Coutts, the Queen's Bank, and it was to do with their back office around their 16 offices globally around investment management. And they were having difficulty pulling all the offices together. And one of the reasons is to do with email. And it's a huge issue because what we got people to do was to write in about some of their experiences from within the teams. And so on the left is actually the experience, and on the right is what we agreed as a team that we should be thinking about. Because on the left, the person said that somebody came up to me with an email, look at me, I've got a compliment. And I told him, have you read it thoroughly? You should read it again, just because this is just saying you're a bit stupid, and that's not at all a compliment. So again, it was back to the Dutch interpretation. So we actually ended up to not jumping to conclusions, and also being very careful in the language that we use. There's a number of very good websites today which weren't around when this was written, which can actually help you with the way that people misinterpret what others say. So, and that's one of CILIP's big things I think you'll find about helping to avoid misinterpretation. This is, I led an event for a company which was fascinating. It was to do with a project where we'd had people from Russia and we'd had people from Bangkok, from Thailand on the team. And there was challenges with communication. So I got them to do a timeline effectively. I said, blank sheet of paper, I want you to look at the stages of the project and just note the highlights down over a timeline. And do you know what was interesting? The Russians did it in a portrait with bullet points, and the Thais did it in landscape with milestones and comments above and below the line. What did that tell you? That unless you agree something formally up front in the way you report back, you're going to have huge challenges when you move forward. And it's always struck me that visual representation is as much as you can hope for. So here's a few things. And this is sort of the before, if you like. Clarity is key, ambiguity is the enemy of progress. This is to do with when you set something up, is about terms. I've worked with so many organizations, big corporations. The big challenge is to be clear about the terms, because ultimately you're only going to get paid if you're clear what the deliverables are and how you're going to be paid against them. I have a big assignment meeting potentially on Friday where I've been invited to participate in a big project for a big organization. And one of the big challenges is going to be, were we to take this on, is going to be around the clarity of what's expected from the deliverables. I helped a friend of mine in Tanzania a few years ago do some work for the African Union. And one of the feedbacks, he presented his recommendations and his report, which were fine, but it wasn't clear who was going to sign off. And he never got paid for about 6 months, which for a person working on their own is devastating. The other thing is prepare for the unexpected. I've been lucky or unlucky, I suppose. I've been in disaster scenarios in Darfur, in the Philippines, with cyclones, in wars in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And you've, even believe it or not, a hurricane in Barbados. You end up with always knowing, if you're traveling, if you've got medication, you have that in your briefcase. You always have stuff in the cloud. And one of the things I've always had is a 50-50-50 rule. The local currency, the euros and dollars, always something like that in your wallet. And I'll tell you this, anybody know, any of you been to Stockholm or Sweden lately?
Not lately, but I have been there.
Okay, so Did you find, what happened when you went to pay your hotel bill with your cash? You may not remember. In my case, they looked at me like I had two heads.
Yes, that I can well believe. Yeah. I lived in Norway for 10 years and they used cards for buying a cup of coffee and a bun. Exactly.
But we've got to that point here now, haven't we, virtually? How many of you actually have cash? It's interesting. So that's one of the challenges. You have to. Then the other thing I've always said to people is look smart, act smart, and be smart. You do get treated as you look. If you are traveling anywhere, you know, trust me, the only time you ever get upgraded is if you look smart. And smart casual is always a must, because if there is ever a situation, and I've been in loads of them, the person who looks as though they are presentable will be treated in a very different way. So there are a few sort of kickoffs. The other thing, that when you're in an organization, it's all about engaging multiple stakeholders. I used to say to everybody who worked for me, it was on 3 levels. If you don't have a 3 level of relationships with an organization, you don't have a relationship. And if you're working with translators, make sure they understand, they know what you're doing. I gave a keynote in Colombia, which was really interesting, and there were 250 people there. And 2 nights, I think the night before, I got my slides back and they were in Spanish. So I'd given the organizers my slides, they came back in Spanish. And they said, here's your slides. And I said, well, I don't know, I'm not using those. And they said, but they're in Spanish. And I said, you get the audience in Spanish. I said, I know, but if I try to speak Spanish to the audience, I said, I'm going to lose completely the meaning. My Spanish is rudimentary at best. So I spent literally half a day with because it was an hour speech, I spent half a day with the translator, who fortunately had lived in England, and we had a really good rapport. But one of the things I've always learned is that you are a team. You have to treat them part of the team. And one of my good friends was an interpreter for the G7, and you spoke Russian. So she used to have to do the translation or interpretation between Putin and some of the US. And she would say, it's one of the worst nightmares if you aren't part of the team, because literally they can then blame you rather than getting you engaged. And I always acknowledge their contribution. And finally, about familiarity, humor is a great thing, but it doesn't always work in every country. And I can remember being in Moscow, opening an event a few years ago, and I told a story which was a true story, that I'd been coaching some of my staff, and one of them was asked to go and give a speech in Tokyo, and I'd given him some prompts, and he came back and we had a coffee, and he said, well, thank you, your comments were really, really helpful. And so I said, well, that's really great, I'm delighted with that. How do you think it went? And he said, I think it went really well. He said, the only thing you got wrong was the bit about telling a joke. And I said, and what he didn't know was I actually had the translation of his speech. And the interpreter had actually said, when he went to tell his joke, laugh, the Englishman's telling a joke. And he then told it again. He said, I told it again. And it said, laugh louder, the Englishman's telling another joke. So it's one of the aspects that I've always found that people don't give enough time to think about. And I guess a few final thoughts on that. It's very important if you're, even if you're traveling and you're not working on international assignments, do understand what's happening in the country. You don't necessarily engage. The best people to talk to very often are the drivers who take you around, or to see how the leaders presented themselves and addressed. When I used to go to the Middle East, it was very funny because at the beginning, the news was about the king greeting somebody at the airport. The second piece of news was the king meeting somebody at the Al Yamama Palace. And the third piece of news was the king leaving the king saying goodbye to the guests at the airport. And that tells you a lot when you get to understand about how the country is run and the culture, and whether people are going to do that or they're going to do that, the way that you greet people. The other thing is show courtesy and respect. It's very easy to say things that we think are perfectly acceptable and are certainly not. And I've now worked for 35 years plus in the Middle East, and I know how difficult it can be. I nearly committed the ultimate faux pas in Iran, where I was on the dais, on the stage in front of a big audience, and somebody gave me a coffee. And you know what it's like when you're about to start. They gave me a coffee, and struggling to find a place to put it, I nearly put it on a copy of the Quran. Exactly. Which you wouldn't necessarily think about, but you have to have that sort of personal antenna that's there. So it is quite difficult sometimes. And again, this courtesy and respect thing, one of the things I did when running assignments in Saudi Arabia, I used to have a regular morning meeting, and I'll talk about that later, to cover any cultural nuances. Anything that came up the previous day, because you need to surface it straight away. The other thing is, who's the PA? Who are the people who make organizations tick? I ran an assignment with the Caribbean Development Bank, the World Bank for the Caribbean. And one of the masterclass, the workshops that we ran was for the personal assistants, because it was about knowledge sharing. And these are the people who make it happen. So that's just one of the things. So, and I guess final thoughts. Detailed field notes and after action reviews as a team. We used to do personal journals and diaries. While in Darfur, one of the things we did every evening was a debrief, because we were in crisis situations and we could get sort of attacked at any moment. And one of the things that we found all the time was just that simple act of telling back what we'd heard and seen during the day was hugely powerful. And so it was just 5 minutes, and it's what military recommend as well. So it's a 5-minute debrief where what you ask, invite the person to say, what did you hear? What did you see today? And then the person will repeat that back, a bit like the Samaritans and the way the Queen worked. And then finally, communicate. Regular dialogue, face-to-face interaction is absolutely massive. So it's weekly calls, put something into a structure. If I'm running an international assignment, first thing I always do is have these built into the curricula so that everybody knows there will be a regular end of mission report or end of mission meeting where we surface what's gone on. So just a few thoughts and reflections. Anybody got any observations, something they disagree with violently or want to comment on?